The air in the logistics tent at FOB Kestrel's Perch was a thick cocktail of diesel fumes, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. It clung to the canvas walls and settled in the lungs of every soldier breathing it. Here, in the jagged heart of the Zagros mountain range, the atmosphere was perpetually thin and tense. Sergeant First Class Alara Vance seemed immune to it. She sat on an overturned crate in a forgotten corner, a cleaning rag moving in slow, hypnotic circles over the bolt carrier group of her M4 rifle. Her movements were a study in economy, each wipe and twist honed by years of repetition. There was no wasted motion, no flourish, just the soft whisper of oiled cloth on parkerized steel. She was older than most of the soldiers on the FOB, her face a road map of sun and time, with a fine, silver-white scar that cut a crescent moon from her left temple to the edge of her jaw. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back in a tight regulation bun that did nothing to soften the hard angles of her face. She was a logistics NCO, a last-minute replacement for a sergeant who'd been medevaced with a burst appendix. Her job was to count bullets, beans, and bandages, to ensure the warfighters at the sharp end had what they needed. To the young soldiers who swaggered past, she was just part of the furniture. A relic from another era, quietly tending to her gear like a grandmother polishing silver. Specialist Diaz, all youthful confidence and unscarred swagger, sauntered by with Corporal Chen in tow. He gestured with his chin toward Vance. "Look at her. Bet that rifle's older than she is," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "Probably got it issued back in the Punic Wars." Chen offered a weak smile, but said nothing, his eyes flicking nervously toward the quiet sergeant. Vance didn't look up. Her focus remained entirely on the piece of metal in her hands. The sound of their footsteps faded, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of a carbon tool against the firing pin recess. She heard them, of course. She heard everything. The casual mockery was as much a part of the ambient noise as the distant whine of a generator or the crackle of a radio. It was insignificant. The only thing that mattered was the weapon. A clean weapon was a reliable weapon. Reliability was life. Everything else was static. Her hands, calloused and mapped with their own set of fine scars, worked with a surgeon's precision. She laid each component out on a worn mat in perfect order: bolt, cam pin, firing pin, extractor. Each piece was inspected, wiped down, and given a micro-thin layer of lubricant before being returned to its place. It was a ritual, a form of meditation in the heart of chaos. The rest of the FOB was a hive of frantic activity. Operation Serpent's Coil, a major push to dislodge entrenched insurgents from the high valleys, was hours away. The air thrummed with the energy of men preparing for violence. Shouts echoed across the gravel yard. The heavy thud of helicopter blades warming up beat a steady rhythm against the mountains. But in Vance's small corner, there was only a pocket of profound calm. She was an island of stillness in a sea of nervous energy. Lieutenant Cassian, the platoon leader for the base's security element, strode into the tent, his jaw tight with the self-important stress of a young officer with his first real command. He scanned the stacks of ammo crates, his gaze sweeping past Vance as if she were a sandbag. "Sergeant," he barked, his voice sharp and high. "Have the final comms packs been distributed to Alpha Company?" Vance finished reseating the extractor spring, her movements unhurried. Only then did she look up, her eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to absorb the light. "They were signed for by their platoon sergeant at 400, sir." Cassian frowned, annoyed by her placid tone. He expected a snap to attention, a crispness that matched his own manufactured urgency. "And the reserve batteries, the encrypted sat phones?" "Packed and palletized for airlift. Stage 4 by the helipad as per the manifest, she replied, her voice low and even. She picked up the bolt and began sliding it back into the carrier. The manifest you signed at 5:30. The lieutenant's face flushed. He had signed it. In a rush of pre-dawn paperwork, he felt a prickle of resentment at being so calmly corrected by this quartermaster. She was support staff, a glorified clerk in camouflage. He was a warrior, a leader of men. Just make sure there are no mistakes, Sergeant. This operation is critical. We can't have logistics screwing it up. He pivoted and marched out of the tent, leaving the implication hanging in the dusty air. Vance showed no reaction. She locked the bolt back into the upper receiver, the click of metal on metal echoing with satisfying finality in the sudden quiet. She didn't work in logistics because it was easy. She worked in logistics because it was essential. Because she knew, with a certainty forged in places Cassian couldn't imagine, that a missing battery could be as deadly as a sniper's bullet. Amateurs talked tactics, professionals talked logistics. The young lieutenant still had much to learn. She picked up the lower receiver and began to wipe it down, her mind already moving on to the next item on her checklist, the mockery and the condescension fading into the background noise she had long ago learned to ignore. The Tactical Operations Center was a pressurized can of recycled air and simmering anxiety. A constellation of screens cast a blue-white glow on the faces of the men inside, displaying drone feeds, topographical maps, and streams of encrypted data. At the center of this technological storm stood General Thorne, a man carved from granite and impatience. His presence sucked the oxygen from the room. He was a commander from the old school, a man who believed wars were won by will and aggression, not algorithms. He had arrived an hour earlier, his helicopter stirring up a sandstorm that seemed a physical manifestation of his personality. Now, he prowled the cramped space of the talk, his shadow falling over analysts and radio men who hunched over their consoles, trying to make themselves smaller. His gaze was a physical weight, assessing and discarding everything he saw as either useful or useless. When his eyes landed on Sergeant Vance, they narrowed. She was standing by a secondary comms rack, methodically checking cable connections and power feeds. In a room filled with high-strung specialists and tense officers, her quiet, methodical work seemed out of place, almost offensively mundane. "Who is this?" Thorne's voice was a low growl that cut through the electronic hum. Lieutenant Cassian, who had been hovering near the general's elbow like a nervous pilot fish, snapped to attention. "Sergeant First Class Vance, sir. She's the replacement logistics NCO. Just making sure the backup systems are stable." Thorne's expression soured. "Logistics? In my talk? During mission prep?" He took a step closer, his 6'3" frame looming over Vance. She didn't flinch, simply finished securing a data cable and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Sergeant, your place is with the crates and the forklifts. This room is for operators. We are minutes from launch. I don't need anyone in here counting paper clips." The dismissal was brutal and public. A few of the younger comms specialists exchanged smirks. Diaz, who had been assigned to monitor a drone feed, snickered quietly. The old woman was finally getting put in her place by the top brass. Vance met the general's hard gaze. Her own was as flat and calm as a frozen lake. "The primary comms array runs through 3 separate power grids, sir," she said, her voice even. "The backup generator on Grid 2 has been reporting intermittent power fluctuations for the past 48 hours. If we lose main power in Grid 3, this entire room goes dark. I am ensuring the tertiary battery backup is properly integrated. It's a simple check." Her explanation, clinical and precise, only seemed to irritate Thorne more. It was the detached tone of a mechanic, not a soldier on the eve of battle. "Are you an engineer, Sergeant?" "No, sir." "Are you a signals intelligence specialist?" "No, sir." "Then I suggest you complete your simple check and remove yourself from my talk," Thorne said, turning his back on her. The matter concluded. "Lieutenant, get her out of here once she's done. I want killers in this room, not clerks." Cassian nodded eagerly. "Yes, General." He shot Vance a look that was a mixture of triumph and warning. She said nothing. She simply turned back to the console, her fingers moving with practiced ease over the diagnostic panel. The lights on the panel blinked from amber to a steady, solid green. Her work was done. She coiled a spare Ethernet cable with meticulous precision, creating perfect, even loops. She did not hurry. She did not betray a single flicker of anger or humiliation. Her composure was absolute, a wall of disciplined calm that seemed to disconcert the onlookers more than any outburst would have. She placed the coiled cable on a small hook and turned to leave. As she passed the main tactical map, she paused for a fraction of a second. Her eyes scanned the complex overlay of friendly positions, enemy intelligence, and planned routes. Her gaze lingered on the designated route for Alpha Company, a narrow canyon designated Vector 7. It was a natural funnel, a perfect kill box. The intel suggested it was clear, but intel could be wrong. Her eyes traced the ridgelines, noting the lack of sensor coverage on the eastern face. A blind spot, a fatal one. It was not her place to say anything. She was logistics, a clerk, a paperclip counter. She had her orders. She continued toward the exit, her boots making no sound on the grated floor. The contempt in the room was a palpable force, but it slid off her like rain from a waxed canvas. They saw an old woman, a supply sergeant. They saw what they wanted to see. She had been underestimated before. It had always been her greatest weapon. She pushed through the blackout curtain and stepped out into the biting mountain air, leaving the men of the talk to their war. The first hint of disaster wasn't a scream or an explosion, but an insidious silence. One moment, the main screen in the talk showed the helmet cam feed from Alpha Company's commander, a jittery view of rock and dust as his team advanced down Vector 7. The next, the screen dissolved into a blizzard of static. A unified hiss replaced the clipped professional radio traffic. Every channel went dead at once. "What was that? Get the feed back up," Thorne roared, his voice cutting through the sudden, shocked quiet. A comm specialist, a kid barely out of his teens, frantically tapped at his keyboard. "I can't, sir. All channels are down. It's not equipment failure, it's a blanket jam. High power, multi-spectrum. I've never seen anything like it." Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep into the room. The drone feed from the Overwatch Predator also flickered and died, its screen showing a link lost error message. They were blind and deaf. Alpha Company had walked into a trap, and the entire multi-million-dollar nervous system of the FOB had just been severed. "Switch to the backup array. Now!" Cassian yelled, his voice cracking with strain. "Trying, sir," the specialist replied, his fingers flying. "But it's no good. They're jamming everything. UHF, VHF, even the encrypted burst transmitters. The whole spectrum is just white noise." General Thorne stood rigid, his face a mask of fury and dawning horror. He stared at the dead screens, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of a console. His men were out there, being slaughtered, and he was helpless. The most advanced command center in the sector had been reduced to a useless box of inert electronics. The sophisticated enemy they had underestimated had just cut their eyes out and their tongue off. "Get me a satellite link. Reroute through the naval assets in the Gulf," Thorne commanded. An analyst shook his head, sweat beading on his forehead. "The jammer is too powerful, sir. It's creating a massive interference bubble. Nothing is getting in or out. It's not just localized to the canyon. They're blanketing the whole region. The orderly, controlled environment of the talk was rapidly disintegrating into chaos. Shouted suggestions overlapped. Men ran diagnostics that all came back with the same hopeless result. The enemy wasn't just attacking Alpha Company. They were attacking the very concept of their technological superiority. And they were winning. It was in that moment of rising hysteria that the blackout curtain at the entrance was pushed aside. Sergeant Vance stepped back into the room. She held a small, ruggedized toolkit in one hand and a thermos in the other. She took in the scene with a single, sweeping glance. The panicked faces, the static-filled screens, the general's barely controlled rage. She registered the specific frequency readouts on the spectrum analyzer, which was screaming with overload. She noted the pulsing, rhythmic nature of the jamming signal, a signature she hadn't encountered in over a decade. But she recognized it. Ignoring the chaos and the incredulous stares, she walked directly to the secondary comms rack she had been working on earlier, the one Thorne had dismissed as irrelevant. She set her toolkit and thermos down with quiet deliberation. "Sergeant, I gave you an order," Thorne snarled, turning on her. "Get out of my talk." Vance didn't look at him. She had already opened a panel at the base of the rack, exposing a tangle of wiring and legacy ports that hadn't been used since the base was first established. "General, your killers are in a kill box," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Your talk is a coffin. With all due respect, sir, you need a clerk." Her words, delivered with unnerving calm, hung in the electrified air. Before anyone could react, she pulled a strange-looking device from her kit, a custom-built breakout box with a series of analog dials and a small, flickering oscilloscope screen. She began to plug it into the old, forgotten ports, her hands a blur of efficient movement. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Cassian demanded, stepping toward her. Vance plugged in a final cable and twisted a dial. The small screen on her device glowed to life, displaying the chaotic waveform of the enemy's jamming signal. "Electronic warfare is a conversation, Lieutenant," she said, her eyes fixed on the glowing green line. "And they're shouting. But if you listen carefully, you can hear them breathing in between words." She pointed to a tiny, near imperceptible dip that occurred in the signal at precise, repeating intervals. "That's it, the refresh cycle. A microsecond-long gap as their amplifiers reset. It's an old Soviet design, powerful but flawed. You can't talk through it, but you can whisper." The room fell silent. The operators and analysts stared, their own panic momentarily forgotten, replaced by a sense of bewildered awe. This was not the language of a logistics NCO. This was the language of a ghost. Vance ignored them, her entire world shrinking to the glowing screen and the tangle of wires beneath her fingers. The crisis had fully descended. The command structure had failed, and in the ensuing vacuum, she had just gone to work. Vance's fingers danced over the interface of her custom-built device, a blur of practiced, economical motion. She wasn't trying to break the jamming signal. That would be impossible. It was a brute force wall of electronic noise. Instead, she was looking for the cracks. She isolated the microsecond-long refresh cycle she had identified, the tiny gap in the storm. It was too short for voice, too short for a standard data packet, but it wasn't too short for a single, compressed pulse. "Diaz," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the nervous tension in the room. She didn't look up from her work. "Give me the last known grid of Alpha and the last known grid of the supporting mortar platoon, Thunder 2. Specialist Diaz, who had been mocking her hours earlier, stared at her, dumbfounded. General Thorne shot him a look that could strip paint. "Do it!" Diaz scrambled, his fingers clattering on the keyboard. Alpha last pinged at grid 47 Charlie-91. Thunder 2 is at the firebase on Ridgeback, grid 51 Echo-88. Vance didn't acknowledge him. Her mind was already processing the geometry, the firing angles, the trajectory. She bypassed the TOC's sophisticated but paralyzed digital network entirely. The old port she had connected to led to a hardwired POTS line, a plain old telephone system landline, a relic of copper wire that ran to the firebase on Ridgeback. It was obsolete, unencrypted, and completely beneath the notice of a modern electronic warfare attack. It was a digital ghost. She began tapping a small key on her breakout box, sending a series of precisely timed data pulses down the copper line. It wasn't code, not in the traditional sense. It was machine language, raw binary instructions timed to slip through the jamming cycle. To anyone listening, it would sound like line noise, a faint crackle of static. But at the other end, in the mortar platoon's fire direction center, a forgotten diagnostic port on their own ancient comms unit would interpret it. "What is she doing?" Cassian whispered to the general. His condescension completely evaporated, replaced by sheer bafflement. "She's talking to the guns," Thorne breathed, his eyes locked on Vance. He didn't understand the how, but he understood the what. He was witnessing something that wasn't in any field manual. Vance's face was a mask of pure concentration. On a small, integrated screen, she had pulled up a cached topographical map of the area. Her brain worked like a fire control computer. She knew the standard deployment pattern for this type of ambush. The enemy would have machine gun nests on the flanking ridges to pin the target, with their command and control element, including the jammer, positioned in a protected spot to the rear. They would expect any counterattack to come from the air or down the throat of the canyon. They would not expect indirect fire, not when communications were down. Her fingers tapped out another sequence. A fire mission. Not a complex set of instructions, but 3 simple data packets, a target grid, a shell type, high explosive proximity fuse, and a command, fire for effect. She sent the packets, then leaned back slightly, her work done for the moment. The entire TOC held its breath. They were all staring at the dead drone feed screen as if willing it to show them something. For 10 seconds there was nothing. Then 20. Cassian started to open his mouth, perhaps to declare it a failure. And then, a new sound came through the TOC's external sensors. Not the hiss of static, but a faint rhythmic series of thumps carried on the thin mountain air. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of mortar rounds leaving their tubes miles away. Vance's eyes were closed. She was listening, counting the seconds. She calculated the flight time in her head. 28 seconds, 29, 30. A new feed on one of the still-active satellite displays. A wide-spectrum infrared sensor that was too low resolution for tactical use, but could detect major heat blooms, suddenly flared. A cluster of brilliant white spots appeared on the ridgeline east of Vector 7. The machine gun nests. Thump, 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 thump. Another volley was in the air. Vance's fingers tapped again, sending a new grid reference, a slight adjustment to the west. She was walking the shells down the ridgeline methodically, brutally. She wasn't just firing at a single point. She was sanitizing the entire high ground. She was a blind gunner, aiming with nothing but mathematics and an intimate understanding of her enemy's doctrine. "She's using the mortar platoon like a scalpel," Thorne muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Without a spotter, without a voice on the radio. The infrared display flared again and again. Vance sent a third fire mission, this time targeting a depression behind the main ridge. A logical place for a command post, a logical place for a very powerful, very hot jammer. The screen bloomed white, a single massive heat signature that dwarfed the others, then slowly began to fade. And, just like that, the static on the main screen flickered. A distorted voice, choked with adrenaline, broke through the hiss. "Is Alpha 6, does anyone read? We were, holy shit, artillery came out of nowhere. The whole ridge is gone. Hostiles are breaking. I say again, hostiles are breaking." The comms specialist's hands flew across his keyboard. "Sir, the jamming signal is gone. It just stopped. I'm getting Alpha Company back online." The talk erupted. Cheers and shouts of relief filled the space that had, moments before, been gripped by despair. The main screen cleared, showing the chaotic but victorious aftermath of the broken ambush. Alpha Company was bloodied but alive, rising from their cover amidst the smoking craters that dotted the surrounding landscape. They had been saved. In the midst of the celebration, no one at first noticed Sergeant Vance. She had already disconnected her equipment. She picked up her toolkit and her thermos. Her face was calm, her breathing even. She had done her job. She turned and began to walk toward the exit, her part in the drama seemingly over. She moved with the same quiet lack of presence as before, as if she were trying to fade back into the background, to become a piece of furniture once more. General Thorne watched her go, his mind reeling. The celebration in the talk died down as every eye followed him, watching him stare at the back of the departing logistics sergeant. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind. The impossible skill, the arcane knowledge of enemy hardware, the surgical precision under fire. And something else, a flicker of memory, a ghost story from his days as a young captain in Special Operations Intelligence. A name whispered in hushed tones around late-night fires in places that didn't officially exist. A legendary operator from a unit that was so secret, it had been erased from the records. A unit that specialized in turning an enemy's technology against them. A unit whose members were identifiable only by a small, subtle tattoo. He strode across the talk, his boots loud on the metal floor. The room fell into a dead silence. He reached the exit just as Vance was pushing the curtain aside. "Sergeant," he said. His voice was different now. All the arrogance and bluster were gone, replaced by a tone of raw, uncertain respect. Vance stopped, but did not turn. "That jamming signature," Thorne said, his voice low, meant only for her, but in the silent room everyone heard. "The refresh cycle, the Soviet S-3B Screech Owl jammer. There were only 3 of them ever recorded west of the Iron Curtain. 2 were destroyed in the Bekaa Valley in '82. The third—" He trailed off, his eyes fixed on her. "The third was captured in '94 during Operation Silent Spade. The agent who captured it, who single-handedly dismantled an entire enemy signals battalion to get to it, had a call sign." He took another step closer. He could see her left wrist, just below the cuff of her uniform, and there, faded by time but still visible, was a small tattoo of a stylized owl with its wings folded, a single star clutched in its talons, a symbol he hadn't seen in 20 years, a symbol that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He looked from the tattoo to the silver scar on her temple. Recognition, complete and staggering, dawned on his face. He felt a chill go through him, the kind of cold that comes not from fear, but from standing in the presence of a living legend. He finally understood who he had dismissed, who he had called a clerk. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, the name spoken with a reverence that bordered on fear. "Nix." The name fell into the silence of the talk like a stone into a deep well. It was a name that meant nothing to the younger soldiers like Diaz and Chen. To them, it was just a strange word. But to the older generation, to men like Thorne, It was a name from a half-forgotten war fought in the shadows. Nyx, the ghost, the operator who could break any code, defeat any network, the architect of a dozen impossible victories who had vanished without a trace when her unit was officially disbanded. They said she had retired or died, no one knew for sure. She had just disappeared until now. Every person in the room froze. Lieutenant Cassian's face went pale, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the back of the quiet logistics sergeant. The comms specialist who had frantically tried to get the network back online now looked at Vance with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Diaz, who had mocked her for cleaning her ancient rifle, felt a hot wave of shame wash over him so intense it was physically sickening. He suddenly felt like a small, stupid child who had been making fun of a sleeping tiger. Vance slowly turned her head, just enough to meet the general's gaze. Her pale blue eyes held no triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." They were just calm. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent confirmation that was more powerful than any words. She had not offered the name. She had not wanted the recognition. She had been found out. Thorne seemed to be at a loss for words. He, a 3-star general, a man who commanded armies and advised presidents, stood humbled before a sergeant first class in his own command center. The rigid protocols of rank and decorum felt utterly meaningless. He was in the presence of someone who had operated on a level he could only read about in heavily redacted after-action reports. He straightened his posture, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep, instinctual need to show proper respect. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't say thank you. Such gestures would have been an insult, a trivialization of what had just happened. Instead, he did the only thing that felt appropriate. He squared his shoulders, brought his heels together, and rendered a slow, formal salute. It was not the crisp, perfunctory salute a general gives a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a legend. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Vance held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave another small nod, acknowledging the gesture. She turned and pushed through the blackout curtain, disappearing into the harsh sunlight outside, leaving a room full of stunned soldiers in her wake. General Thorne held his salute for a full 3 seconds after she was gone before slowly lowering his hand. He turned, his face hard and unreadable, and scanned the faces of the men in the talk. His eyes settled on Lieutenant Cassian, who still looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. "Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable weight of command, "you will find Sergeant Vance's quarters. You will ensure she has whatever she requires. You will assign a runner to her, for her exclusive use. And from this moment forward, you and every soldier on this base will afford that sergeant every courtesy and follow her every instruction as if it came from me. Do you understand me, Lieutenant?" Cassian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He could only manage a choked, "Yes, General. Crystal clear, sir." Thorne swept his gaze over the rest of the room. On the face of every soldier, from the lowest specialist to the highest-ranking officer, he saw the same thing. The mockery was gone. The condescension was gone. All that remained was a profound, silent respect for the quiet woman who counted bullets and bandages, the ghost who had walked out of the shadows just long enough to save them all. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. The legend of Nyx was real, and she was walking among them. Hours later, as the first pale light of dawn began to bleed over the jagged peaks of the Zargos Range, Phoebe Kestrel's perch was quiet. The adrenaline of the battle had subsided, replaced by the weary calm of survival. The wounded had been treated, the dead had been honored, and the silence of the high mountains had once again reclaimed the landscape. In her forgotten corner of the logistics tent, Sergeant First Class Alara Vance sat on the same overturned crate. The M4 rifle lay disassembled on the worn cleaning mat before her. The battle in the talk, the revelation of her past, the general's salute, all of it had faded. There was only the task at hand, the ritual. She picked up the bolt carrier, her movements as slow and deliberate as they had been the day before. The whisper of oiled cloth on steel was the only sound in the cavernous tent. But the atmosphere around her had fundamentally changed. Before, soldiers had strode past, their laughter and casual insults filling the space. Now, they gave her corner a wide berth. They would enter the tent to draw supplies, see her there, and fall silent. They would complete their business in hushed tones and leave, casting sideways glances filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Specialist Diaz stood near the entrance for a long time, watching her. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to thank her, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say to a woman like that? He remembered his stupid joke about the Punic Wars and felt a fresh stab of shame. He had been a boy mocking a god. He simply watched her for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, his own lesson learned in the most humbling way possible. Vance methodically finished her work. Each piece was cleaned, inspected, and lubricated. She reassembled the weapon with the fluid grace of someone whose hands knew the task better than her own name. The final, solid click as she seated the receiver echoed in the quiet tent. It was the sound of order restored, of a tool made ready. She did not shoulder the rifle. She simply laid it across her knees and looked out through the open flap of the tent. The sun was cresting the highest peak, bathing the valley in a clean, golden light. It was a new day. For the men of Alpha Company, it was a day they had not expected to see. She sat there for a long time, perfectly still, watching the sunrise. She wasn't Nix anymore. She was Sergeant First Class Vance, a logistics NCO. She counted the bullets. She managed the beans. She made sure the bandages were where they needed to be. And when necessary, she reminded the world that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is the one you underestimate. The sun climbed higher, and she remained, a silent guardian in the quiet dawn, her clean rifle resting in her lap,